Well, hello everyone, and welcome back to the channel. Thank you all so much for tuning in. In today's video, we are going to once again talk about Hurricane Lee as it continues to move northward now, just parallel of the mid-Atlantic shoreline, from the Carolinas getting back up into the northeast region, where we are expecting Hurricane Lee to continue to move northward into Maine and Nova Scotia by the time we get to this weekend. We are expecting that it will likely be anywhere between a Category 1 to a tropical storm. We're going to break down specifically during this video all of the hazards we're expecting out of this system by the time we do get to the weekend, which is going to be flooding as well as storm surge and damaging winds being the primary hazards. We'll kind of label where we expect to see the worst of those conditions going into the weekend, and we'll also take a brief update on Invest 97L, which is just off the coast of Africa right now and is expected to become likely a tropical depression, if not a tropical storm, by the time we get to this weekend. We talked about it a little bit yesterday. We'll go a little bit more into detail today on what we're expecting out of that, but it will likely be Tropical Storm Nigel by the time we see Hurricane Lee make landfall out here in New England, as well as Nova Scotia, New Brunswick. So if you do enjoy the videos, be sure to like and subscribe, share with family and friends who will likely be impacted by this system. By the way, you're going to find out that even if you're not being directly impacted by Hurricane Lee, I'm talking about you guys in Long Island and points northward and southward, if anything, you still will be seeing likely some strong swells that get up to the shoreline, maybe even some high waves. We'll talk about that here later on in the video. So there's a lot of implications for folks on the East Coast, even if you're not getting directly impacted. So you want to share this video with folks all along the East Coast, from say New York City and points north, and even some points southward towards Maryland as well as Delaware. With that being said, let's get into today's video. All right, folks, we will start by taking a look at the map that we've been looking at the last few days on this channel, and that is the water vapor imagery. Now, this is a still image, but I really like how this illustrates the environment that Hurricane Lee is in. If you take a look at this, if you recall from the last few videos, this is dry air. Anytime you see this sort of yellowish orange tint, that is indicating dry air aloft. This is our upper level water vapor imagery. And so as we've seen over the last 24 to 48 hours, some of that dry air has actually intruded into the center of this system. We actually do have a drop sonde for you guys that will actually illustrate a lot of what I'm talking about here. But the point being, if you notice these bands, a lot of the convective bands in the southwestern quadrant of this system of Hurricane Lee have pretty much disbanded altogether. There's very little convective shield here that's perturbing any of this dry air for getting towards the center. So we have had a lot of dry air intrusion over the last 24 hours, and that has severely impacted the strength of Hurricane Lee, as it is now below major status and hovering right around a Category 1, Category 2 threshold. In addition, what we're also talking about here is a shortwave trough. We mentioned this also on yesterday's video, but you can actually see the cold front demarcated here by your water vapor imagery. Anytime you see dry air sort of, making this kind of arc, that's indicating a frontal boundary. And so this is a very clear example of a cold front. You have your northwesterly flow that's coming back behind it, and that's going to bring some colder temperatures here to the northeast. But as far as Hurricane Lee, that's actually going to help to steer it north-northeast. So it's currently going a little bit in the north-northwest trajectory, but as this front continues to move east-southeast, that's then going to push Hurricane Lee north-northeast. And if there's any, good news, and I wouldn't even call it good news, if there's any news at all, it's that there won't be a direct impact to Maine. We're going to see more of that landfall taking place in Nova Scotia. What you're going to find, though, throughout the video is that these conditions are going to be spanning several hundred miles due to the fact that Hurricane Lee is expected to expand its wind field. So just because you're not receiving a direct impact doesn't mean that you're not going to get any impacts at all. As a matter of fact, you're still going to feel some of those effects. It may not be everything on the dinner table, but it's certainly going to be a couple of things that are going to impact your days going into the weekend. And that's the whole point of this video, guys. We're going to be touching on a lot of that. So keep in mind right now, it's fighting off a lot of dry air intrusion. You got this trough digging down too. That's going to help to steer it north-northeast. The other component of it is that you have colder temperatures as you increase northerly in latitude. And with this shortwave trough digging southeast, it's also bringing with it quite a bit of bulk shear that's going to also start to rip this thing apart quite a bit. So any of these convective bands that are still hanging on together right now as we speak are likely to be inhibited by that shear as that continues to move through. Not only is it going to steer Hurricane Lee, but it's also going to act to weaken it. So the last few videos that I put out, we showed the temperature map, we showed the wind shear, we showed this water vapor imagery. I'm not going to be showing the sea surface temperatures because very little has changed on that front, and as well as the wind shear map I'm not going to show in this video either. But just know that if you recall from the last couple of videos I put out, this frontal boundary here that's moving east, this cold front, let me go ahead and actually erase this. This cold front that's placed right here in the northeast, that's bringing with it a lot of shear. So shear is going to act against the hurricane. We already have dry air intrusion acting against it and helping to weaken it. And not only that, but as we increase north in our latitude, it's starting to interact with those colder sea surface temperatures. So this is why we're not expecting to see it re-intensify. If there is any slight re-intensification, it's not going to take us into a major hurricane status. It's probably just going to be a matter between fluctuations of tropical storm and hurricane status. This is really the holy grail of what I wanted to talk about. This drop zone is absolutely fascinating. Now keep in mind, this was as of 10Z, so this would have been very early in the morning today. And as you can see, take a look at what happens with your temperature and dew point, right? So the 200 level is what we consider our upper levels of the troposphere, or our upper level jet. Look at your dew point. This is very dry air aloft, right? And you're probably thinking, well, Brendan, usually there, is that split off and that deviation in temperature and dew point as you get higher up, especially if the storm has any sort of subsidence. Very good point. Kind of like what we talked about yesterday. But here's the problem. Even though you have dry air in the upper levels, that's not where it stops. You have dry air even getting its way into the mid-levels, so sort of in the jet stream level of our atmosphere, and you have another bulge of dry air in this corridor, and yet another one towards the surface. You see your dew point slightly decreasing. What that's telling us, all these demarcations, is that you have a lot of dry air that's feeding into multiple layers of this storm, from the surface going back up into the upper levels of Hurricane Lee. That is a terrible sign if you're looking for a strengthening hurricane. It's eating up a lot of dry air right now. Some of that's even getting into the center of the storm. We've seen that eye pretty much erode as of this morning. We'll take a look at that here in a second. But if there's any good news at all, is that Hurricane Lee is expected to weaken. It's already weakening right now. This is not anywhere near what we saw when it was a Category 5 just several days ago. You can also see the breakdown here of your temperature as well as relative humidity. Take a look at that. 200 millibar relative humidity, 2%, right? 2% relative humidity. That is incredibly dry. 250's at 23%. Even as we get to 500, you got 46%, and then down towards the surface, 76% relative humidity. So this thing is really experiencing some drier air. The temperature towards the center continues to decrease. We like our eyes or our centers to be really, really warm, but we've seen the center of it starting to decrease its temperature the more we drop our drop zones. I expect that to continue to decrease as we move forward. So don't expect it to be 26 degrees Celsius by the time we get to Nova Scotia, right? The center of this storm is probably going to be cooler than that. And again, look at your relative humidity. You got some very dry air intruding at the 500, intruding at the 200, and then even getting down to the surface of 925 and 999, which is about 81 to 76%. Keep in mind, this is an unknown location of where they dropped it. It's probably somewhere near the center, more than likely, or on one of those outer bands. Regardless, this still is a bad sign if you want a strengthening hurricane, and a good sign if you want it to weaken, because there is a lot of dry air being eaten up into this system at all different layers if you were to really break it down and cut this thing open like an onion. So at least for folks in Maine and New England, I would say that this is some pretty good news. I would love to see this thing weaken and continue to do so to sort of inhibit much of the effects that we saw when it was a Category 5. Here is the IR satellite And guys, I mean, we just showed it at the top of the video, but look at this. There is no convective banding taking place in the southwestern quadrant of this hurricane. We do have some deep convection towards the center, a little bit more organized than what we were seeing in the last 24 hours. But still, the problem remains that a lot of dry air is seeping into this thing because you have some openings within the convective bands. A little bit more organized as we get into the northern tier. Not much dry air to the north, so it's not surprising to me that your convective banding is a lot more structured and organized to the north of the center. But keep in mind where your dry air was. It's to the west and the southwest of the system. And so that's why you're seeing some very weak to little to none in the way of banding or convective bands on the southwestern quadrant of this hurricane. That's expected to continue as it moves north. The dry air still keeps feeding into this thing, and that's not going away anytime soon. We're going to start by looking at the GFS, and this is really important, guys, because what this is actually showing is something that I've been talking about the last few days. You see, what the GFS is showing is its wind field really starting to increase and expand as it moves northward in latitude. Like I said, I've been talking about this the last few videos, but I wanted to visualize this and provide you guys an illustration on what this would look like, of course, courtesy of Tropical Tidbits. And here's actually a still image of that. Take a look at what happens here. You have it go to a 961 according to the GFS, and look at your isobars. See how far they extend out? Let me switch to another color so you guys can see it. Look at how far that extends out. Those isobars and this sort of this northerly wind is essentially moving right through Long Island. Okay, so this is something that I want to bring up to you guys. Just because you're in Long Island, New Jersey, and Boston doesn't mean that you aren't going to still feel the effects of this, right? What happens is this wind field, because it's increasing northerly in latitude, remember, it's going to be encountering more of that horizontal temperature gradient, the cold air to the north, warm air to the south. That's going to help to really increase its baroclinicity and expand its wind field. So if you're at, say, Long Island, and by the way, this would be Saturday morning, according to the GFS, you guys are certainly going to be experiencing some strong winds as well, possibly on the order of sustained 30 to 40 miles per hour at times, maybe even gusting up to 45. And that's because your wind field is extending far away from the center and encompassing this area. Now, keep in mind that your wind direction, because we move counterclockwise with our wind field in the northern hemisphere, these winds are likely to come out of the north. I actually have a couple of friends who work for the FAA down in this region, and that is going to be a huge issue. Even if it's not making a direct impact, those winds are going to be a problem. But then the other thing that's going to be a problem too is the rip currents and the swells that come from this. Because we have an expansive wind field, we're going to be seeing some pretty nice waves here, even as far west as Long Island and New Jersey. Let me just show you the one last thing before we get too far ahead of ourselves. This is as of Sunday morning, once it's expected to make landfall near Nova Scotia as well as Maine. Again, for my friends in Maine, even though you are not likely to see a direct landfall, look how far that wind field expands. Not only that, but look at your precipitation. You're going to certainly be dealing with some heavy rainfall, potentially even some flooding concerns as we get into Sunday. So, just because you are not getting the direct landfall of Hurricane Lee doesn't mean you're not going to be impacted. For our friends here on the East Coast, I'm certainly concerned about beach hazards. You should not be out in the waters. It's going to be some pretty nasty rips. And then as well as some strong winds during the day, probably 30 to 40 miles per hour with gusts up to 45. For our friends up towards Maine and Nova Scotia, we'll talk about you here more in depth towards the end of the video. But I'm going to tell you right now, I certainly expect your winds to be anywhere between 50 to 60 miles an hour sustained with gusts potentially up to 75 for a brief period of time, especially for our friends in the Gulf of Maine and then on the shorelines here of Nova Scotia. So here is the latest hazards here, peak storm surge forecast. This is just for folks along Long Island and New England, right? Where we could potentially see up to 4-foot storm surge in Cape Cod and Provincetown. Why is that? Because our winds are going to be out of the north. And so when you have winds out of the north, what that's going to do is, keep in mind, this is sort of like a bay, right? This is like a bay, or sort of a gulf or a bay, whatever you want to call it. And so because your land is sort of curving like this, it sort of acts like a bowl, right? So your winds are going to be coming out of the north, and that's actually going to suppress the waves because it's being compressed due to the fact that this is a very, sort of enclosed shoreline for the most part. It curves like a bay. What's going to happen is we may see those 2 to 4 feet storm surge issues, especially around Cape Cod and Provincetown for that reason. So let me just explain that once more so you guys understand that. If we have winds coming out of the north and we have this curvature of a shoreline, well, because of physics, that's actually going to compress your storm surge. So it might actually aggravate and intensify the storm surge wherever you're in this bowl, right? This curvature of a shoreline. So it does not surprise me that Cape Cod as well as Provincetown and Chatham are in the worst conditions forecasted for storm surge. It's for that very reason. So if you have any questions on that, let me know down in the comments below. I can explain the physics behind it. But again, up to 4 feet storm surge, may even be higher than that for folks in Cape Cod and Provincetown. By the way, we got 1 to 2 foot storm surge forecasted for Long Island, as well as getting back through Nantucket and Martha's Vineyard. Even though you're not in this sort of this bowl or this bay area, especially around Cape Cod, doesn't mean that you're not going to experience some storm surge. Potentially seeing up to 1 to 2 feet, even 1 to 3 and 2 to 4 feet for folks in Nantucket. So very dangerous swimming conditions. You definitely don't want to be out in these waters during this period. The weather is going to be very dangerous and life-threatening for anybody that's out there. So you want to make sure you're heeding the advice of local officials. If they're telling you to stay off the beach or stay off swimming, stay off. Do not do it. There's people that die from that every year. Please do not become part of that statistic. Stay out of the waters. Now, this is the GFS significant height. This is keeping in mind wave height. Now, the GFS does tend to overdo this. This is in terms of feet. I don't expect us to see that high of storm surge once we get into the Gulf of Maine. That being said, I would expect that along the coast of Nova Scotia, that you're probably going to see north of definitely 5 to 7 foot storm surge. And that's going to be because the center of the system is going to be moving directly into your area. I would again expect the worst of it to be Nova Scotia, especially for our folks in Maine. Remember how I just talked about the Cape Cod situation with the physics, kind of that bowl curvature, right? Well, keep in mind, if our wind vectors are pointing out of the north, right, that's also going to cause some strong swells and storm surge right in this corridor. So especially this area right in sort of the Bay of Fundy as well as the Gulf of Maine, I'm very concerned about, because when that water rushes in, it's going to be compressed in those little tight corridors. So we might expect to see the strongest storm surge to be between the Bay of Fundy as well as the Gulf of Maine, and including the shorelines of Maine as well as the coastline of Nova Scotia. This also brings with us the flooding concerns, right? So far we talked about the storm surge. We haven't yet talked about the damaging winds. We touched on it, but we'll go more into detail here in a second. But there also is flooding concerns, and this is from the Weather Prediction Center. They have already put out a slight risk for flooding for all of eastern Maine, eastern and central Maine. We are expected to see north of 5 to 6 inches of rainfall over the next 24 to 48 hours once it makes landfall. So beginning on Sunday, probably even Saturday night. So Saturday night going into Monday, we are expected to see some pretty high precipitation totals for this area. Now, I would not be surprised if this got upgraded to a moderate risk for flooding. It hasn't yet done so, but as we get closer to that date, and as our convective and allowing models pick up more on the total rainfall, would not be surprised to see more rain come out of this system. So you're not getting a direct landfall, Maine. That's been the theme of it throughout the entire video. It's highly unlikely you're going to see a direct impact, but we already talked about the storm surge, and we're already talking about the fact that you could see some significant flooding to flash flooding concerns in your region with the system. It's carrying a lot of moisture with it, and so we definitely need to be concerned about flooding. Turn around, don't drown. That is my advice to you, as well as for folks that are on the coastline. Don't go swimming, okay? It's going to be very dangerous for that. If there's 2 takeaways from this video, it's going to be those 2 pieces of advice. Now, This is looking at just the discussion from the Weather Prediction Center on the flooding. Rainfall totals 1 to 4 inches are possible. Not many significant changes were made to the flooding forecast, but much of eastern Maine has seen above average precip over the past few weeks, which will elevate the stream flows and lowering FFG values. Heavy rains from Lee may produce localized urban or small stream flooding. So you guys are not in a drought right now, so we're really not going to be focused much on runoff, but that doesn't mean that you're not going to flood. If your soil or your water table is too saturated, it's not taking any more water. So we could still see flooding or flash flooding in roadways as well as streams because these streams haven't had the opportunity to recharge yet. So what's going to happen is most likely is the flooding first will start with the streams and the small creeks. But then if any of that soil becomes too saturated, then it's not going to take any more of that rainfall into the soil, and then it's expected just to then run off. So you don't just get runoff in drought. Sometimes you can get runoff if your soil is way too saturated. So just because we're not dealing with a drought doesn't mean that flooding isn't a concern still. So folks in Maine, definitely going to be flooding for your hazard, as well as some strong and damaging winds. And speaking of that, here is the latest track on Hurricane Lee from the National Hurricane Center. Current advisory has it as a north-northwest at 9 miles per hour with sustained winds of 115. Guys, I expect that number to go down as we move forward the next couple of days. It would not surprise me. It is fighting a lot in the way of the variables we talked about, from the temperatures being colder to the wind shear to the dry air, and that's just going to continue to get worse, especially as it makes landfall. It's going to be dealing with topography and higher elevations, and that's going to act as a frictional component to weaken the hurricane. We've also talked about that too in the last couple of videos. Just wanted to remind you guys, do not be alarmed or concerned. This is not expected to be a major hurricane, but even though it's not going to be a major hurricane, we are going to be seeing hazards of flooding, storm surge, and even some damaging winds. Now, we do have, and it's not listed here on this map, but we do have hurricane watches and tropical storm watches all throughout Maine and Nova Scotia, and we do have hurricane warnings for Bermuda. Keep in mind, this was the advisory from yesterday. I want to just correct that. We do have the latest one that came out this morning, which does list Maine and a lot of the coastline through Nova Scotia being under hurricane watches and tropical storm watches, and Bermuda is currently under a hurricane warning. So keep in mind, I do apologize, this map is a little bit dated, but just know that we do have hurricane watches for the coastline of Maine as well throughout the Gulf of Maine, and then we do have those extending through the coastline of Nova Scotia. We are expecting this still to maintain its hurricane status as we go through the next couple of days, and it will likely make landfall still as a hurricane before then quickly transitioning to a tropical storm. For folks in Maine, especially, and for folks in Nova Scotia, expect winds, because of that large wind field we talked about, to be anywhere between 50 to 60 miles per hour with gusts up to 75 possible. Very strong winds. Remember, we're not talking about damaging gusts here. We're talking about straight line winds, 50 to 60 miles per hour consistently. So that's going to certainly cause some damage. You want to be prepared for that and make sure you take your proper precautions and heed the advice of local officials. But again, this is still something not to play around with. Even though if you don't get evacuation orders, you should still take this seriously. Take all the precautions to keep you and your family safe, because there is a very hazardous system moving your way. It's presenting quite a bit of hazards, as we've just talked about. So we're not out of the woods here. Even though it's weakening, it's still going to have plenty of impacts as we move forward. And finally, here is the latest spaghetti plot. Very high confidence here on where the center will end up. It's likely going to be Nova Scotia. It's finally made that turn. Our trough is starting to dig east-southeast like we talked about at the top of the video. And so it's not going to be really far-fetched to say that we have a lot higher confidence now where the center of Hurricane Lee will set up. It's likely going to be right at Nova Scotia by the time you get to early Sunday morning, and then expanding westward into the Gulf of Maine and the Bay of Fundy. Last thing that's not listed on this map that I just want to touch on, we do have our Tropical Invest 97L that is out here just now off the coast of Africa, continuing to move west-northwest. It now has a near 90% chance of developing into a tropical depression in the next 24 to 48 hours, and also a 90% chance that it develops here further in the next several days. So, as I promised, we haven't really touched on it too much here over the last couple of days. It is still very far out, but we are monitoring the situation with Invest 97L, what will eventually become Tropical Storm Nigel as it moves west-northwest. Once Lee makes landfall and we move on, and it moves off the coast and away through Greenland, then we would go ahead and turn our attention then to Nigel. So we are expecting it to be Tropical Storm Nigel. If anything, it's going to likely be by the time Hurricane Lee makes landfall here in New England, and especially for Maine and Nova Scotia. Would not be surprised to see that. May even also see some rapid intensification beyond that point. So we'll continue to monitor it. Currently no threat here to the United States as of right now. But just like we did with Hurricane Lee over the last several days, we will continue to monitor the situation with Invest 97L and provide you continuous coverage and videos on that as we get into next week. Hey, thank you so much for tuning in, and if you did enjoy today's video, be sure to like and subscribe, share with family and friends who will be impacted by Hurricane Lee, and we will see you tomorrow on our next weather video.